Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, Healthcare Digital Transformation in a Multi-Cloud World with Ahead in Dell Tech. Before I hand things over to our experts, I'd just like to mention a few housekeeping items. Please make sure that you enter any questions you may have for the speakers in the Q&A widget, not the chat. But we will address these at the conclusion of the presentation. And then just a reminder as well, this webinar is being recorded for future views on our Ahead IO resources page. But without further ado, I will hand things off to Andy Sages from Ahead and George Morris from Dell to introduce themselves and get things started.
Thanks, Caitlin. All right, thanks everyone. Good afternoon, thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Andy Sages. I'm a Principal Client Solutions Architect at Ahead with a heavy focus in healthcare. A lot of people might not know this, but about 45% of our client base is in the healthcare space. And with Dell Technologies being one of our very highly valued partners, we have a lot of synergies in the way we go to market with healthcare. And joining me today is George Morris. George, would you like to give yourself a quick introduction?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I'm George Morris. I'm the North American CIO for the Dell Technologies healthcare vertical. I've got about 30 years in healthcare, over 23 of that as a CIO. I do strategy and solutions development for most of our top customers all over the world, mostly in North America, but a little bit globally. My background is I started out as a developer and worked for a few startups, and then I moved into the healthcare side as from the technology perspective, and then worked my way up. So I also support some of our major ISVs like Epic. So I do some strategy with them as well as some of our other EMR customers. So thanks for the intro, Andy.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of give everyone a little bit of background, when George and I were collaborating about a couple months ago on a prospective client, we were talking about just our go-to-market, strategy and our talk track around how we approach cloud not just public cloud, but hybrid cloud and multi-cloud with our healthcare customers. And what we noticed, there's a lot of synergies in the way we kind of message. And what George and I decided to do was, take this to the side and see how we can collaborate together to even build out more of that synergy. So this is the net result. And like I said, Dell Technologies is a very valued partner with us. We've seen a lot of success helping support our healthcare customers with Dell Technologies. So without further ado, I'll kind of jump into it. All right, so this is a little clip I took from a Gartner article read about in 2019. I know it's a little bit old, but ultimately what Mike Jones is saying is by 2020, 40% of our healthcare providers will realize that their EMRs can no longer fully support their care delivery needs. And ultimately what that's telling us is, and we're seeing this even post-COVID, is supporting an EMR or building out an EMR is no longer the gold standard, right? So I think there's this thought around, if I build Epic and run it really well, that'll help me with my recruiting high talent, top talent, like top positions. And that's what most healthcare systems were aspiring to maybe 5-10 years ago. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of CIOs, and I've heard them say themselves, is that running Epic well is no longer good enough. If Epic or Meditech or any of the EMRs don't have a feature, they want to build that on top of, right? So there's now a more, you could say, supportive digital needs around what we want to build around an EMR. So, George, I'll let you hit on this.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comment. As we've talked about, Andy, we see EMRs moving more and more off to the side, and some other applications starting to take a little more center stage. I don't think the EMR is ever going to go away. It's obviously a critical piece of the operations and will always be a key tier 1 application. But there are certainly other applications that are becoming very important from a care delivery perspective, things like virtual care, things like taking advantage of marketplace opportunities and products like from an AI, ML, and analytics perspective from GCP, Azure, and AWS. But what's interesting in the attributes of all those is those are modern applications, and they're delivered in a different way. Today, the vast majority of our healthcare applications are COTS oriented, right? And they're delivered in a methodology where we get updates, and those go into our non-prod environments, and we test, and then we bring those into production. In these new platforms, from a multi-cloud perspective, they're all PaaS platforms that have a very, platform as a service that have very enriched APIs. And so you need containers and DevOps organizations and being able to manipulate containers to be able to start taking advantage of integrating those applications back into your current products and portfolio, your current application sets. And so the days of just doing integration with HL7 are, and Fire are probably still going to be there, but today the integration is taking place in a much different way. So organizations are really looking for an easy button and how they can do this transformation. And it's a people, process, and technology approach that we'll talk about in a little bit. But at the end of the day, it's got to be a secure method that is allowing us to enable these new kinds of experiences for our patients and new kinds of functionality for our clinicians and business owners. So I think what we're hoping to summarize today is show you a path on what that easy button could look like. And I think the collaboration that Andy talked about that was really fun for us as we came together and developed the solution for this particular customer is we really felt it was the closest thing we've seen to an easy button yet in the teaming up of AHEAD and Dell Technologies.
So really, when you think about public cloud and a lot of these digital transformation needs, or even like the digital care needs, a lot of what we're seeing in the healthcare space is there is not only is it just the specific critical care apps, but it's also the whole ecosystem that supports a healthcare system. So whether that's the partner system or that's the marketing and digital experience group, virtual care has been obviously top of mind with everyone talking about post-COVID and telemedicine. But ultimately, what we see is it's not just one driver that's directing people towards public cloud. It may be specific services that they're looking within the public cloud space, like AI and ML, that are kind of pushing them in that direction. So like George said, no one's getting rid of the EMRs. A lot of these off-the-shelf apps still exist, and nor is it reasonable to run those types of applications in the public cloud. It's usually an on-suite of additional features and functionality for other types of applications that are pushing a lot of organizations to public cloud, or even to start thinking about consuming public cloud. So what are those public cloud use cases? So, I break it down in these three groups: business intelligence, research, and operational efficiency. If we think about business intelligence, contact tracing, obviously with post-COVID, that's been a topic top of mind lately. We think about denial management, or fraud, waste, and abuse. I've worked with a lot of organizations that are building enterprise data warehouses around trying to understand where they're seeing, for example, insurance denials for specific type of services or specific type of CPT codes. If we look at in the research space, genomic sequence, cancer research, a lot of those big data needs or those digital pathology needs are driving a lot of organizations to leverage some services within public cloud. And then operational efficiency. If you look at virtual care and telemedicine, like we said, that's obviously been within the past 6 months, a huge accelerator for these types of digital needs. And then census forecasting, patient bed scheduling, ambulatory scheduling. The idea that we can run the healthcare system or even increase the patient experience by looking for patterns within the health system to kind of eliminate, waste within efficiency in the way they operate the health system.
Yeah, Andy, I would add, if you start looking at things like the virtual care platform, those capabilities really cover a really large cross section of the organization. So it's integration back into the clinical delivery, both from an ambulatory as well as handoffs into the acute world. It also is a linkage back to your call centers in a CRM perspective. And again, this is being delivered as a platform that has API driven. So you need a different operating model and a different set of technologies to really enable them and enable those capabilities. So those platform emergence, virtual care especially, and we think virtual care is a little bit different than telemedicine with a video visit. It's a little more complex with data driven. But at the end of the day, we're seeing that adoption being rapidly moving forward much quicker, right? So things are moving much faster post-COVID, and we're starting to see IT organizations really, be challenged in how they're going to live in these two worlds. So I think this is the driver, but we still got to deal with all the old stuff, so we can get into now and how we try to solve that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so most IT organizations that I talk with across the country and globally take a bottom-up approach as they're trying to solve this issue. So as they start looking at how they're going to support their traditional IaaS, as well as how they're going to work on a strategy of investments to start moving from their traditional platforms into this new world, what I see them do is really look at architectures from a technology and on up. And what I think is the synergy between Ahead and Dell that I really liked as we started to come together is we really flipped that upside down and say we really got to look at the application workloads down. And why is that? Well, the portfolio today is majority of COTS applications, and those applications are very dependent on the underlying architecture and technologies for their performance, their resiliency, and their scalability. And if you don't take into account the very specific attributes of some of those COTS applications, you can start running into problems as you start trying to move them into a IaaS or maybe even an off-prem IaaS. So you've got to understand that portfolio, and you've got to understand then the dependencies around it. So if you think about your EMR as we talked about today, as pretty much the core and center, as you start moving that off to the side or start bringing other applications into the center, however you want to think about it, there's a bunch of other applications that are dependent. We see that most EMRs have somewhere between 15, 20, maybe even more solutions that enhance what the EMR is doing or have additional clinical and business functionality around care delivery or revenue cycle, as an example. And those applications have to be looked at together as you start looking at architectures from a modern IaaS perspective. So you got to get those dependencies down to really get the architectures correct. We also want you to look at rationalizing and starting there, because there's probably some duplication and some ways to narrow that portfolio and get those applications maybe to a smaller number. So as you're building this new plan, you don't necessarily have to take into account all of them. You can start retiring them into a pattern that's strictly for app decommissioning and allowing that data to just be available to the folks that need it. And then you can, get the benefits of not having to spend money. As well as you look at that rationalization, you can start figuring out where's the overlap. Maybe some of these new platforms have better functionality, and so you may retire some of that out of your existing COTS and move those into your modern apps. And we've even seen some healthcare organizations really going forward and accelerating. I've got one organization nationally that I work with that's actually been out creating digital studios now that are developing applications and really starting to branch out on their own to augment some of the functionality that the EMR today isn't able to deliver. So application first is really important. That allows you to architect into patterns, and then those you ruthlessly standardize on those patterns to go forward.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll add there is around rationalization. I would say this is very, very common around organizations that are in acquisition mode. And I think that we've seen that over the past 5-10 years, where a lot of some of the larger providers are acquiring hospitals or smaller systems. And when they start to do those acquisitions, that's where they start to find a lot of overlap. And trying to boil that down to a smaller subset of applications, obviously, will make this a lot easier.
Yeah, the ambulatory, that's a great point. And the ambulatory acquisitions that healthcare went through in the last 5 to 10 years has really made that problem prevalent, that there's, multiple EMRs, multiple versions of the same EMR. Yeah, and you want to get those out of that ecosystem as quickly as possible. And, again, we've got ways through Dell and Ahead that can help you do that.
Absolutely.
So I talked about those patterns, Andy, and we've done some analysis at Dell across over a dozen organizations in North America. And then if you expand that globally, it's probably getting closer to 50 organizations that we've taken a look. And we really see as you look at the applications and you start getting your ecosystem together, that you can really architect around these 6 patterns. And What's interesting is most of them fall into the first two, but there's some interesting attributes about those first two. So pattern one that we see that can take the vast majority of the applications is hyperconverged, fully software defined pattern that most of us are familiar with today. Although there's, again, because they're COTS applications, as you're looking at that architecture, you've got to get the nodes correct for those hyperconverged platforms. So things like, your presentation layer with Epic and Hyperspace requires a little different architecture than a heavy SQL server that you're going to want to put in this environment. One of the interesting idiosyncrasies, though, is although that pattern can take the vast majority of applications, it's pattern two that really ends up eating up most of the investment. We see in this analysis that things like databases for an EMR or your imaging application caches, both cache 1 and cache 2, or as you start to even go into a VNA, that's where the vast majority of investment goes on that infrastructure. So even though it's only taking up 10 to 20% of the total workloads, it takes up more than 50% of that investment typically. So you have that more traditional client server platform that you can apply converge to if you'd like, or the traditional, server network and storage environment. The third pattern that we see is requirements around regulatory and older applications. We're always going to have some on-prem premise, some on-prem existence of workloads, things like nurse call, things like infant induction, older imaging gateways. And then we're also seeing organizations start to push real-time point-of-care analytics. There's some really interesting things that I'm seeing folks do some development on algorithms where they're pushing analytic data to the edge and then providing some algorithms or even some AI ML application on it, and then pushing that into an EMR clinical delivery or EMR workflow. Pattern 4 is that retirement pattern that we talked about, and there's some specific attributes around that from a data governance perspective and a data presentation layer to make sure that that data is available as you retire the applications in the way that the workflows are required in a clinical and business perspective. We talked about the DevOps side, that's emerging from, and you need a pattern for that that's typically hyperconverged, that starts on-prem because that's the vast majority of where your data sits. But as your multi-cloud strategy starts to mature and your DevOps organization starts to get going, then we see that very quickly going into a multi-cloud approach with both on-prem and off. And then if you're an organization that does a lot of research, we see that final 6 pattern from a high-performance computing perspective, AI, ML perspective around genomics, analytics, imaging, things like in digital pathology. So ruthless standardization around these patterns is one of the key tenets of the strategy that we're reviewing with you today.
Yeah, when I first sat down with George, and George produced this slide, and the reason I love it is because when Head works with a lot of healthcare customers around public cloud, we know for a fact no one's lifting and shifting their data centers, and no one's shutting down their data centers and bringing it into AWS or Amazon, or sorry, AWS or Azure. What we're seeing is obviously there's the large majority of applications that they have today are going to continue to exist on-prem. It's the newer cloud services that they're longing for that are driving towards public cloud. But ultimately what this means, I think, for the next 5 to 10 years, hybrid cloud is going to be around for a really long time. I think as you look at the core set of applications that most healthcare systems are leveraging today, the majority of those sit on-prem. But that doesn't mean negating any capabilities in the public cloud, because we know that they still need them. It's more along the lines of how do you balance that? And I think this is where I think that I love this slide. And when you look at the additional messaging that we'll show you later, I think that's where it really starts to hit home on how do you build that hybrid cloud strategy, and more importantly, how do you build that multi-cloud strategy?
Yeah, so that leads you to what does the strategy look like, right? And once you get ruthless standardization around the patterns, we want you to be able to manage and govern through one pane of glass, one workflow, one methodology. So that really starts with what you've got to own. You want to have your own self-service portal, right? And if the organizations and the lessons learned that from organizations that I've spoken with that were cloud first, most organizations are moving to cloud where it makes sense now, although there's still a few cloud first out there that I talk about, that I talk to. But regardless of what your methodology is, you don't want to have multiple platforms and multiple associated portals that you've got to use to manage it. You know, it's interesting. Healthcare spent somewhere in the magnitude of 35 billion in meaningful use to go from a best of breed solution for EMRs, then to only jump into cloud in a best of breed fashion, right? So EMRs, we went best of breed to consolidated, integrated, and now we're best of breed again. We don't think that's the best methodology, and the organizations that early on that have delved into it learned the lessons of best of breed and the problems with that, except it's worse now because in the past, all that stuff was on-prem. Now that when you're talking to support in cloud, it's not yours. You're talking to the help desk and at the mercy of what they're doing. So we really want you to run that through your own portals. You run the portal that has your business and operations management, that drives automation, orchestration, and whether that's an on-prem environment for your COTS applications with IaaS, or it's IaaS in another environment, you still have that same portal driving it. That orchestration then drives software defined. And again, if it's software defined IaaS, or if it's software defined for a CAS-PaaS platform, it's still the same portal and the same methodology. So that's the plan that you execute from the top down. But you're going to execute, or the strategy that you're going to execute from the top down, but you're going to actually implement it and from the bottom up, right? Because at the end of the day, we all don't have the budget to just go with green fields and move everything there. So opportunistically, you want to look at your investments that are ruthlessly standardized around those patterns and that are software defined as you go forward. And that will allow you then to step into it when it makes sense. One of the things I see organizations using as an example is you're doing those Epic upgrades on a quarterly or semi-annual basis. And sometimes we know that Epic requires some pretty good infrastructure enhancements. So those are refreshes typically, and that's an opportunity to look at how can I take those patterns and that architecture, start looking at the application ecosystem around your EMR like Epic, and then start building those architectures that are software defined to start moving into this environment.
Yeah, that's great. And the other thing I'll add around self-service portal, I think what we preach a lot with a lot of healthcare customers is governance and security, right? So if you create that self-service portal and you create those service offerings that they can consume, or your users consume, or the business units can consume, you then push down your governance and security around on-prem as well as public cloud.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, Andy, a lot of the early adopters that I've spoken with, you know, they had to adopt each of their cloud providers' governance, right? Rather than pushing that governance back to the cloud provider or making their portal adhere, and they only move workloads that make sense from a governance perspective, because we know some of the cloud providers work differently than others, especially around HIPAA compliance. And so there may be some things that one cloud provider may do from a governance perspective that's better for a particular use case or workload than another. But that can all be driven out of your portal rather than having to check everybody else's individual portal. And then you potentially having to have a middleman interpret that for your end user as you start rolling these capabilities out to the user.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Spot on. Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you do it? Well, you know, this is where Ahead and Dell Technologies and VMware come together to help provide it. And, you know, this is the both worlds that we're going to be living in for some time. So this is actually built out of the use case of a large organization that we've helped go into this new paradigm. And again, what you see and what we talked about is simply ServiceNow and that portal at the center driving both worlds. So ServiceNow is the portal. That base has all the governance built into it and the rule sets. That then can drive into a financial costing model So as you look at the potential landing zones for a particular request, not only from a governance perspective, you can fold into that costing perspective. That drives into VMware's VCF capabilities. And then on the left, that drives into the traditional IaaS with automation and orchestration and those patterns we talked about. In this particular case, we're using Rail and Pattern 1 and PowerEdge and PowerMax and Unity Power and as Pattern 2. And then we have the plugins from a scripting perspective that will link for those products right into VRA and VRO and help you drive all that. And then if you're developing and taking advantage of some of those new modern applications, same portal, same experience, that can drive through a VMware Tanzu using some of the orchestration and automation we have around containers. The key piece of this is from an operations perspective and from an end user perspective, it's what you know and what your end users are familiar with. So on the portal side, maybe you're going to start with IT and provide those capabilities within IT, and then eventually roll that out in a near far methodology. At Dell, I can, through our ServiceNow portal, I can set up a DevOps environment as well as spin up IaaS for VMs if I'm doing some testing, and we do that all through our ServiceNow portal. And then finally, those solutions automatically then incorporate Elastic Cloud, things like a federated namespace with Elastic Cloud storage, how we're going to do data protection and maybe include a cyber recovery solution, but then also make sure we have a global data protection standard under all that to make sure it matches what the business continuity goals and objectives are for your particular healthcare organization, hitting those RPO and RTO goals. So again, using VMware at the tip of the spear, using Dell Technologies is underpinning all of it, using a head to help you bring that all together. This is how you can implement it, no matter where the landing zone is. Sorry, Andy.
Oh, no worries. And when I first saw this slide, George had showed me kind of his vision of how he was approaching this. When I looked at ServiceNow as the cloud manager, I got really excited because that is what the heads been working on and bread and butter for, I would say, the past 3 to 4 years. So when George showed me this, I then brought him this and I was like, look, we can help organizations do this. So whether it's public cloud, Azure, AWS, or GCP, or on-prem with VMware and Dell, we can build a service catalog within ServiceNow, create that front-end interface, allow us to choose what services we feel like we need to provide to our organization, whether that's IaaS, PaaS, or any other native service, and then allow them that front end to actually provision those services. So when George showed me kind of his vision, I then brought him this live demo, which I'm about to show you guys. Is we can build this on top of your existing private cloud. So let me jump into the demo here. There's 2 versions of this. One is a service catalog we built for an organization that wanted to build a cloud provisioning portal not only for their on-prem, but also public cloud. So not only can I pick my VMware stack, I can then start to build t-shirt size VMs, whether it's Linux or Windows, and kick this provisioning process off, and then actually provision this within VRA and VRO. Same with the public cloud, whether it's Azure or AWS, I can leverage CloudFormation or ARM templates to do my automation portion, but building a ServiceNow front end allows me to kind of put this all together. Another version, and this is the more modern version, is what we call Automation Hub. And I'll show you guys what the back-end architecture of this is, but it's a little more simplified. Allows me to build a service catalog based on my need. In this case, I only have a single OS server request. I could build this based on public cloud. I can build this on PaaS services. And in this case, I'm going to provision a single OS. I fill out my form just like I would kind of any other orchestration automation tool. Windows 2019, plug in my memory. Let's just say it's going to be 2 gig of memory. My CPU counts, I could say 6 virtual CPU. My VRA use of 12 days. Single instance to deploy. I can pick my data center. I can have my users pick their data center, or I can build the backend logic around where I want to put these types of workloads based on other questions that they provide. And then for all intents and purposes, I can choose a compliance, whether it's HIPAA for healthcare or PCI for others. In this case, I'll say no. And then this would be my request. Now on the back end, if you go into kind of our ServiceNow instance, let me just refresh this. You'll see on 924, here's my request. If I go into my request, I can actually see what's happening with the request. So for example, I'll go into it. I'll see the catalog item I requested. If I have any approvers for that request, I'll see that as well. And then more importantly, I start to see the notes and activities. So in this case, this kicked off a VRA provisioning into VRA. And then if this was rejected or approved, I would see that. And I can follow the entire request from beginning to end. And this is how we provide that front end provisioning portal that George is talking about, whether that's on-prem or public cloud. So what does that back-end architecture look like? And I'll show that to you guys. So what we've called it more recently is ServiceNow Integration Hub or Automation Hub. So ServiceNow becomes kind of the requesting interface where we intake all service requests. We then send it to some sort of orchestrator, whether that's VRA for my on-prem, or in this case, we're saying Terraform for public cloud. I can leverage both based on whether I'm looking at private or on-prem. And then more importantly, as we kind of build more use cases for our developers who may not want to use a ServiceNow profile, we can actually leverage some CI/CD tools to actually leverage those same automation functions and essentially bypass the ServiceNow portal. So it kind of gives you the best of both worlds. I give you that cloud experience for some users who just want to be able to click buttons and drop down menus, or I can actually leverage the same orchestration tools to provision, whether that's IaaS VMs or PaaS services through, say, for example, Azure DevOps or Jenkins. So this is where I have been spending a lot of time in this space around ServiceNow and bringing that all together, and then obviously partnering with our valued partner Dell Technologies on how do we build that private cloud experience to give our healthcare systems that public cloud experience. So tying this all together, this kind of quick commercial for what I had called the Head Digital Delivery Platform. This is how we build digital initiatives. So we know these are the same digital initiatives that we want to provide to healthcare organizations listed up top. And we see it in kind of these 5 pillars: modern applications, so building the CI/CD pipelines and tool chains to provide those capabilities to our developers. Building some intelligent operations around visibility and log aggregations, so we can actually look into not only the infrastructure layer, but also the application layer, and give us key indicators on how that affects our business. Enterprise cloud. So from our perspective, we see enterprise cloud as all encompassing, whether it's on-prem or public. We know there's services we want to provide back to our users, and whether that's an HCI stack on VCF or leaning towards PaaS services like serverless in AWS, the enterprise cloud is all encompassing, and it's kind of going back to George's slide around the multi-cloud vision. And then everything around enterprise enablement. So building that service manager, building out that service catalog, tying it into, say, a CMDB, and allowing us to give us that single sort of source of truth for everything we do. So building a single source of catalog, building a single source of truth within our CMDB, and then tying it all together with relentless automation. So everything we want to do, whether it's process bound or provisioning bound, we want to leverage automation anywhere we can. And then obviously security being a big pillar with our healthcare customers as well. So I'll tie this off just as kind of a quick commercial. If you like what you guys saw here and you want to hear more of it or see more of it or kind of go a little bit deeper into the weeds, Head, Dell, and VMware are more than happy to host you into our executive briefing center, where we not only do briefings, workshops, lab demos. We'll go a little more into the weeds around the demo I showed you guys today. We have the capability to show anything within the Dell VMware portfolio across our many labs. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions. Caitlin, do we have any questions that came in?
Yeah, looks like I got one here. I've heard arguments for and against multi-cloud. How do you rationalize when multi-cloud makes sense?
You want to go first, Andy, and then I'll add?
Yeah. So I hear that one a lot, right? So I think, and that's something that I had that we've kind of waffled around whether when people bring up multi-cloud, are they going to go into all three clouds, or are they looking at private cloud and one other cloud? I think from our perspective, multi-cloud or even hybrid cloud are kind of one and the same, right? So if you think about building a cloud or light experience on my on-prem environment, that's definitely important. And then when we look at kind of which cloud provider to go into, or do I bring on multiple cloud providers, I think ultimately we see organizations kind of gravitating towards one and getting really good at that. There's always going to be something that pulls you into, say, a competing cloud provider. So for example, they're building an Alexa app and it has to be on AWS. I think more often than not, the business need is going to win than the technical rationalization around trying to be strictly on, say, one cloud provider. But what we do know for a fact, I think within the healthcare space, on-prem is going to be around for a while. So I think at least leveraging hybrid cloud, and to George's point, public cloud where it makes sense. I think at least opening up to a single cloud provider definitely makes sense. But then I think don't withdraw the need to move into other cloud providers if the business cases are there. George, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I just add to it, and I agree with everything you said there, Andy. I think you're spot on. But what I would add to it is cloud is an operating model. That's how Dell thinks about it. It's not about the destination. So whether on the traditional application side, which is mostly IaaS, whether that's on-prem or off-prem, you want the value proposition to determine where the best place to land the workload. Is it something that you're going to use as software as a service, which is essentially IaaS somewhere else and somebody else running that application for you, traditionally for most of the healthcare applications? But it's all about that value prop. The point I think that we were making in this presentation is that wherever the workload needs to land, it makes sense to drive that from a value prop perspective. And through that portal, from a governance and even cost perspective, your end users can determine that as they consume IT services in an operating model fashion. So when I talk to organizations about this cloud approach, I want to see that people, process, technology coming together and help them understand with the operating model change, and then the workloads will fall where they make sense. And that's what supports the cloud when it makes sense strategy, because then you've got the workload landing in the best place it needs to land. The modern applications are a little easier, but then there's the data governance issues still that have to be managed using that portal, but those can move around a little easier as containers. But the traditional applications, you can do that again through that portal and the value propositions that can come through on that. The last piece I'll leave is just again stressing you got to understand your applications portfolio to really understand where's the best place that makes sense to do that governance and financial determinations and really take a look at a TCO. I see organizations using IaaS off-prem for lots of reasons. Many times it doesn't have a lot to do with financial, it has a lot to do with other things that the organization has going on. And we can present those use cases as organizations want to go a deeper dive into that.
Yeah, it looks like we got another one here. Do you see any difference in approach post-COVID-19?
I'll take that one first, Andy, if that's okay. Yeah, I see it accelerating. I still see the same approach, but I see organizations now prioritizing investment because of the new paradigm that we're all in with remote workforce and having to take advantage of those platforms, with the acceleration of virtual care and new care delivery models and moving away from or evolving from a telemedicine video visit to a virtual care environment, and also acceleration and investment, and then utilizing all that data that's starting to come in from the ambulatory arena now, taking advantage of IoT, and those also being capabilities that are in the public cloud. So I think post-COVID accelerated everything. I was talking to one of my peers at Dell the other day, and we've been talking about modern apps now for a couple of years in this multi-cloud platform and this two-world existence or three-world existence we're going to live in. And we were right about where we were going to end up. We were wrong about what the motivation was going to be to accelerate it. And COVID actually, nobody, none of us could have predicted that. But I've seen as folks are coming out and budgets are starting to ease up and healthcare is starting to recover, I've seen that at the top priority now on how are we going to retool to take advantage in a way that scales and makes sense using this kind of strategy. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah. No, and George, I agree with you 100%. And not to 100% reiterate what you just said, I think absolutely COVID's accelerated this. I think if you think about telemedicine, there's all these other digital interactions that are happening, whether it's ordering labs, ordering prescriptions, scheduling on the back end with nurses and physicians. I think ultimately what we're seeing is to George's point, a huge acceleration in this space, because I think not only is there need, like no one predicted it, but more along the lines of, I think there's a lot of motivation from a business side to expand the capabilities there.
Yeah, care delivery models are just rapidly evolving, right? We're trying to limit how caregivers are being from an exposure perspective. We're starting to funnel folks into a sick kind of workflow and a well workflow, and all of that is requiring new types of clinical capability, technology and workflow capabilities that just weren't really utilized much in the prior world before COVID. So we see both the application vendors, the platform vendors, we see emerging technologies coming out very, very quickly now, and IT is struggling to keep up with it. The speed that this stuff is coming out is really kind of a little mind-boggling and hard to keep up with.
Awesome. So we got one.
One more maybe.
Yeah. What do you see as the biggest pitfalls for leveraging cloud services?
Andy, you want to take
I can go first, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So when you think about public cloud services, I think the biggest challenge I see in the healthcare space is, I would say, to George's point, it's an operating model, right? So some of the operating model, the way you operate within a public cloud may be a lot different. So I would say there's definitely a skill set ramp up. And then the idea of not only are we reskilling on the operations side, but it's also, I would say the services within a single public cloud provider are hard to wrap your head around, not alone many, right? So I think that's why we always talk about just, get really good at one, be able to kind of digest the services that are available, filter those out, and make sure that, you're doing your due diligence on, from a government perspective, what services you do allow back to your business units or business units. So what I would say is the biggest challenge is from an operational perspective, and I just was talking to a healthcare customer yesterday in one of our vision workshops, is how do you digest everything from a services capability perspective, but also make sure that everyone's skilled appropriately? Because I think that there's a shift there, and I think it's definitely a struggle that we see within the healthcare space.
Yeah, dead on, Andy. I would add to it, that many organizations, as they look at cloud, treat it differently than other technologies, right? So we've gotten better from a governance perspective of looking at products and having strategies for on-prem technology, only to kind of abandon that for off-prem. And the bright shiny object syndrome is coming back. And it really is no different than any other technology. You have to have a strategy to incorporate it, a strategy to support it long term, have governance around it, and life cycle around it. So our approach is really, again, what we talked about. It is that operating model. It's not a destination. And understand the value prop and consume the technology no matter where it is, in the ways that are tried and true for your organization, that follow governance and understanding the value proposition and get you to the metrics and the ROI that you're looking for those IT investments.
Yeah. And George, you're spot on. Just to reiterate one piece there is what we've seen is successful in these types of scenarios is the same approach from an on-prem perspective, where you have enterprise architects doing evaluations on different types of products. The same thing should be done from the services capabilities. Just because AWS has 200 services doesn't mean those should be available. You still want that architectural review in regards to when a new services comes out or services change, right? Because with public cloud, they change weekly now. It's more along like having that same architectural review of those services and then making a decision on what's best for the organization.
Yeah, it's just another technology. It's just got a lot of capability.
Perfect. All right. So I think that's enough for the questions. I think, George, this is great. I think ultimately I would like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. And I mean, feel free to reach out to George and I if anyone has any follow-up questions. And like I said, we're more than welcome to host you guys in our executive briefing center with Dell Technologies, VMware, and ahead. George, any parting words from your end?
No, I wanted to thank you, Andy, for you and your team for putting this together, thanking everybody for their time today in attending. And again, this is I think it's recorded, so if you have colleagues you want to push this out to, please share the link with them. And whether it's virtual or it's something we can do in a virtual briefing center eventually here, we're happy to do a deeper dive, present use cases, and get more specific with what your specific organization needs are, your particular organization's needs are. We know all healthcare organizations are in a little different place, and I think doing a deeper dive is very helpful in trying to chart out what the course could be. So thanks for your time, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, George. Thanks, everyone.